morning, everybody. I'm Aaron Merrill. I'm a program manager for outreach at the Mercatus Center. I took over the Capitol Hill campus from Mary Godis. You might remember her, those of you who've been here for a while. We are trying something new today, a breakfast meeting. So I appreciate you all coming in this early. It's great to see so many people here. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. In front of you, you have a copy of Jerry Brito's working paper on the BRAC spending commission models. There is also a longer working paper. I have a few copies in the back if you would like the longer version, or I could email you a copy if you give me your email addresses afterwards. That's fine also. The surveys on the top are very useful for us, so if you could hand it to one of us who have a badge at the end of the program, or there's a number on the back you can fax it to if that's more convenient, that would also be very helpful for us. So I guess with that, we'll get started. Jerry Brito is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. He is the director of the Technology Policy Program. He serves as an adjunct professor of law at George Mason University, where he received his JD. His research focuses on technology, communications, telecom, government transparency, accountability, and the regulatory process. He has published op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, the Miami Herald, and many other places, and is a contributor to the Technology Liberation Front, a technology policy group. So without any further ado, please welcome Jerry Brito.
Thank you, Aaron. Yay. So today I'm going to talk to you about BRAC and how the BRAC model, the Base Realignment and Closing Commission model, can be used for spending reform. So the first thing to note is that federal spending, debt, and deficits are all-time highs, and that there is general agreement that spending needs to be cut. And here is President Barack Obama. He said, in these challenging times, when we are facing both rising deficits and sinking economy, budget reform is not an option. It is an imperative. We cannot sustain a system that bleeds billions of taxpayer dollars on programs that have outlived their usefulness or exist solely because of the power of a politician, lobbyist, or interest group. We simply cannot afford it. So this is the president. Folks on the other side agree with this as well. And notice I'm not saying that cutting spending is the full solution to the deficit problem, to the budget problem. It's just that we can all agree that there are cuts to be made. There are programs that exist in this way, right, that exist solely because of the power of politician, lobbyist, or interest group, or that are otherwise outmoded or wasteful, and that they could be cut. So what's stopping Congress from doing this? If everybody agrees on this, that there are programs out there that could be cut, that are wasteful, what's stopping Congress? I think it's that every program has a constituency, right? This is a typical public choice dynamic of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. Each of these programs has a beneficiary that is relatively small relative to who has to pay for it, which is the taxpayers, which are very spread out and widespread and can't organize themselves. These small constituencies can easily organize themselves and put pressure on Congress and put pressure on the folks who represent them to keep these programs going. So with that in mind, how is it possible to do a line-by-line review of the budget and axe out all the programs that might merit axing out, as a president and as many in Congress have promised, right? So I think Senator Voinovich said it best. He said the biggest problem we must overcome in this effort is that almost every program in the federal government, no matter how ineffective or spendthrift, has its own core of supporters. It would be wishful thinking at best to believe we can restructure or shut down large numbers of programs across multiple federal agencies without provoking a firestorm of opposition. Nevertheless, that task must be undertaken if we are to have any hope of providing taxpayers the most effective and efficient government possible. So the thing is, though, is that Congress has found itself in this situation before. And it found itself in a situation before with military bases, right? Military bases are a lot like federal programs. And in fact, some scholars would say that if you look at the capital spending at military bases actually are more valuable to communities than traditional sort of the pork that we might think of as far as bridges or dams or whatnot. Military bases have motivated and easily organized constituencies, right? In this case, they're actual geographic constituencies, really clear, as opposed to maybe a program that has a constituency that's more geographically dispersed. And similarly, like federal programs, the cost of a military base is taken up by everybody, all taxpayers, so it's dispersed. So how have we previously gone about closing military bases? Well, you know, the number of military bases in American soil has fluctuated throughout history, right, with there being more in time of war and time of perceived threat and less otherwise. So before World War II, this was really, traditionally, this was a military matter. It was not a political matter, the number of bases and where they would be. Normally, the Department of Defense or the Department of War would decide which bases to open and which to close. After World War II, there was a real glut of military bases. And the Kennedy administration promised to cut these extra bases to sort of reap that peace dividend at that point. And in 1961, Defense Secretary McNamara announced plans for a major reduction in military infrastructure. And this resulted in the closing of about 700 bases in 3 years, which was unprecedented at that time. And Congress was very alarmed by these vast cuts that were unprecedented. But there was no formal way that Congress could intervene. And so as a result, because Congress couldn't get involved with this, this was just something for DOD to do, of 954 realignments announced between 1960 and 69, only 2 were not completed. So again, this really concerned Congress, seeing this many bases being closed at one time. And so as a result, what was a military matter started becoming much more political. And in 1965, Congress passed a bill that would require 120 days notice before DOD could shut down a base, right? So before, DOD just shut it down whenever they decided to. Now they had to notify Congress. Of course, this is 120 days. Congress could spring into action to drum up opposition to this. And secondly, it would require that that sort of notice could only be given between January 1st and April 30th of any given year. So it really reduced the window when DOD could act. And in fact, a conference report that went along with that bill said very clearly, the reason we're doing this is to give Congress an opportunity to write restrictive language into military authorization bills to prevent the closing of any particular base that they don't want to see closed. So they were very transparent about why they were doing this. So President Johnson vetoed this bill, saying that it threatened separation of powers, his ability to be commander-in-chief. But there was some negotiation, and eventually he signed a bill shortly thereafter that was pretty much the same bill, except that it applied only to the 250 largest bases, and it brought down the notice period to only 30 days. But you can see at this point now, Congress was putting a stake in the ground saying, no, we have a say in military base closures. So now, even though the largest bases were exempt at that point, there were still closures in 65, 67, 69, in 70, and in 73. In 73, there was another big uproar because there was another large set of bases that were closed. Now, after Vietnam, it was a replay of World War II, right? In 1976, DOD announced a big round of base closures, and Congress had had enough at that point. Congress passed a bill that required DOD to notify Congress of not just the bases that they were going to close, but of candidate bases. And it also required them to conduct environmental impact statements, impact analyses, which result in impact statements, that made closing a base at least a year-long affair to do. So President Ford initially vetoed this bill, but it came back up again. He eventually signed it, and it was for, I think for just one period. I think it might have been an authorization bill. President Carter later in '77 signed the same law without an expiration, so it became permanent. And so Between 1977 and 1988, as a result of this, we had 0 base closures, not one. Base was closed in this period. So why was this? Again, it's the notification aspect of it meant that Congress could spring into action when they see that a base in their district is being targeted. And what weapon does it have? Well, it has the environmental impact statement, right? The Army takes a year to put this together for a particular military base that they're thinking of closing. At that point, the member of Congress or citizens in the community can challenge that environmental impact statement in court, and the court could mandate that it be done again, right? And that could take another year or two. So this became a very expensive and very protracted process, so much so that the Pentagon eventually gave up trying to close military bases. So again, for over 10 years, there were no major military bases that were being closed. So Congress, essentially shut down base closures without being seen to act in an overtly parochial manner. Instead, by requiring that base closures comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, Congress was seen to be acting in the public interest. So what changed in 1988? Well, the Cold War was ending, and there was, again, a promise of a peace dividend. There were massive deficits, chiefly because of entitlement spending and defense spending. There was an obvious glut of military bases after the Cold War, and especially after a decade of 0 major military base closings. And so there were obvious need for cuts because of the deficit, and the military bases were the obvious target. And there was also lots of public pressure. You saw major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, editorializing about this and pointing to the military bases and saying, look, this is where you can cut to sort of help out with the deficit. And you had the BRAC Commission as well, which was appointed by President Reagan to look at where there was a waste in the budget, and they really pointed to military bases as a big part of that. And there was a political roadblock, which is the same as always, right? Yes, a member of Congress could say, I'm for cutting spending, right? I'm for cutting bases because it's obvious. There's a military military base glut. We need to cut some. I'm definitely for that. But my base is critical to national security. So yes, I'm for cutting military bases. Anybody in his constituency would applaud this member for being for military base closing, but not this one, though, right? So that was the roadblock. So what removed that roadblock? It was BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closing Commission. Its intellectual father is Dick Armey, and he introduced this in 1987. Sort of a different version. The original version was different, and I can talk to you later about what was different about the original version, and it almost passed. Then he reintroduced it in 1988. At that point, he had 100 co-sponsors, and he had Defense Secretary Carlucci along with him. In fact, Carlucci had appointed what became the first BRAC Commission before the BRAC Act passed. And this helped because members of Congress were able to see who would be in the eventual BRAC had they passed it. So what does BRAC do? Very simply, Congress creates a panel. Congress creates a blue ribbon commission and says, choose military bases that are wasteful, outmoded, otherwise unneeded, and whichever bases you choose are going to be shut down, unless we come back and we reject the full list, right? So they always reserve that power to themselves, of course, to say, no, we don't want to accept your choices of this list. So what does this have to do with 2010, right? What does this have to do with today? Well, what do we see today? Again, we see massive deficits. There's an obvious need for cuts, right? We saw President Obama saying, look, there are many programs out there that are outmoded, wasteful, that we know we could probably get rid of. There's public pressure, which I'm sure you all are aware of, to see some budget reform, some spending cuts. But again, we have this political roadblock, which is what Senator Voinovich was talking about. Of course, I am for cutting wasteful programs, but this program I really care about very much. You know, all these programs over here, yes, of course, are very wasteful, but not this one. And if everybody says it's not this one, and not this one, and not this one, eventually you get to all of them. That's a political roadblock. So this has led many to propose basically a BRAC for spending. And so what's the idea here? Again, Congress would create a panel. Right? This panel would choose which programs are wasteful or ineffective or outmoded, and then there would be an up or down vote on this list. So it's a good instinct, but before we plunge in this direction, I think we need to understand why exactly did BRAC work. Right? Was it as simple as creating a commission? Did that, simply by virtue of having a commission, by having an up or down vote, was that what made it work? So I think there's some key things that I've identified that are what makes BRAC really unique and make it work. Number one is membership, right? BRAC was a blue ribbon panel, and on it there were no sitting elected officials, there were no sitting appointed officials, right? So no senators, no representatives, no treasury secretaries were on the panel. The panel was composed mainly of many retired military folks, some environmental professionals. The point is that these folks had no political careers to protect. Right? They were running for office. They weren't going to be taken to task in the press or by their constituencies for the decisions they made. Secondly, BRAC had a very clear mission and criteria about how to carry about that mission. So the mission was very clear for BRAC. It was cut outmoded military bases, cut unneeded military bases. They weren't tasked with figure out what the U.S.'s military force structure should look like, and then basically be a mini Pentagon and make those decisions. No, they were just told, identify unneeded military bases. And the criteria that they were given were very clear, right? If you look at the BRAC's original charter, it was military need, there were some environmental factors, but what they were tasked with looking at was spelled out. Finally, and I think very important, is this notion of silent approval, right? So, folks talk about an up or down vote as being the thing that makes BRAC work, but I don't think that's all of it, and I don't think that's the most key thing. I mean, sure, there was a fast track out of committee for the resolution of disapproval of the whole BRAC list, and you can have amendments for that. It would be fast-tracked out of committee and out of into a vote. But again, that was just for a resolution of disapproval. So let me see if I can explain this to you, because it's a little subtle. You can conceive of a BRAC where you have a commission that comes up with a list of military bases, and at that point, this list is sent back to Congress, and Congress votes up or down to accept this list. And if Congress accepts the list, then those bases are closed, right? That is not how BRAC worked. Sir, do you have something?
I've been living with BRAC for the last 9 years, so I'll just wait for that.
All right. I'm sure I'm about to get an education from your facial expressions. So that's not how BRAC worked. The way BRAC works is that the commission comes up with a list, and at that moment, those bases will be closed. Unless, at that point, Congress can do nothing else, and those bases will be closed. Congress can come back, of course, and inevitably there's going to be a member who's going to introduce what is called a resolution of disapproval. And if this resolution of disapproval is approved, then that list goes away, right? So you vote yes or no on that whole list. And that's a very subtle difference. And do you see why? So Phil Gramm, I think, explained this. This was at a point where he was debating and speaking in favor of passing BRAC back in the 80s. He said, the beauty of this proposal is that if you have military base in your district, under this proposal, I, Phil Gramm, have 60 days. So I come up here and I say, God have mercy, don't close this base in Texas. We can get attacked from the south. The Russians are going to attack Texas. We need the space. Then I can go out and line the street, and the bulldozers are coming, and I have a trusty aide there just as it gets, the bulldozer gets to me to drag me out of the way. And all the people will say, Phil Graham got whipped, but it was like the Alamo. He was with us until the last second. Right? So what does that mean? It means that Phil Graham, having a base in his district, can say, I am for closing bases, like everybody is. Right? Everybody agrees we have a glut of military bases. And so you vote to pass the BRAC Act and create this commission. Then later, when the commission chooses a base in your district, you can jump up and down and say, this is terrible, and fight and be seen by your constituents to fight to keep that base open. But eventually, once that resolution of disapproval gets to Congress, you're not voting, you're never seen to vote to close down a list of military bases. At that point, what you're voting on is a list of bases to save. And there's really, most folks who don't have a need to vote for that list. So does that make sense? Hopefully, in Q&A, we can make that sharper. So let's look at some recent proposals and see how they stack up with these criteria that I've set up. So first of all, let's just look at BRAC. Right? BRAC, obviously, membership, Blue Ribbon panel, no politicians on the panel. Mission, very clear with criteria, silent approval process, which I just discussed. So let's take a look at the Conrad-Gregg bill, which creates a national bipartisan task force for responsible fiscal action, right? This task force idea. And this bill got a lot of attention in early 2009 when it was offered as an amendment to the perennial bill to increase the federal debt ceiling. And President Obama endorsed this bill, and it failed by a few votes. So how does it fare on membership? Well, the bill would create this task force, and this task force would be composed of 8 sitting senators, 8 sitting representatives, the Treasury Secretary, and 1 other executive branch official that would be appointed by the president. So 18 members total, large panel, pretty much all politicians with a career to protect. So it fails on that margin. Mission. The mission of the task force, according to the bill, would be, quote, to review the fiscal imbalance of the federal government and to propose legislative language to address these factors. So very amorphous, not very specific about, it's not cut programs, find programs that are wasteful. It is figure out the fiscal imbalance. So fails on that margin as well. And finally, the silent approval. And the way this would work is that it would create this task force, which would go out, come up with some legislation, and then that would go back to Congress, right? And at that point, Congress would have to vote on it. So there is no silent approval there. And again, the reason this is important is, let me put it to you this way. Let's say that a list comes back with a list of federal programs that should be eliminated. As a member of Congress, you are then going to be on the record voting to cut program X that is on this list. Whereas if you had silent approval, the way it would work is the following. You vote to create the task force. At that point, you have voted to cut unnecessary spending. Everybody's for that, right? Then the list comes back, and now you have the option of voting to save the programs on this list. That's a very different sort of political dynamic that takes place there. So next, let's look at the Fiscal Commission, the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, which is deliberating right now. It's chaired by Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles. It sort of came about through executive order after the failure of the Conrad-Gregg bill. So what's the membership like? 6 senators, 6 representatives, and 6 citizens appointed by the president, which happen to be private citizens and that are in private industry and from nonprofits. So again, total of 18 members, big panel. 2/3 of those are sitting politicians with political careers to look forward to. So it fails on that margin. Mission, if you look at the executive order, you look at the charter, it's the commission is charged with, quote, identifying policies to improve the fiscal situation in the medium term and to achieve fiscal sustainability over the long run. end quote. And there is no limiting criteria besides a mandate that it proposed recommendations to balance the budget by 2015. So again, very amorphous. It could be suggesting programs to cut, creating new programs, raising taxes, lowering taxes. It's a mini Congress in that sense. And what about silent approval? Well, again, no, simply because, as Senator Gregg said, before the commission was created, anything created by executive order would be toothless, meaning that, sure, they're going to have a set of recommendations, but Congress is under no obligation to consider them, much less to consider them in any fast-track manner or any silent approval manner. So, fails there. So finally, let's look at the Congressional Budgetary Accountability and Review of Federal Agencies Act, CARFA. This budgetary component is sort of new, so they still call it CARFA. And this is perennially introduced by Senator Brownback. So how does it fare on membership? Well, the commission that would be created here would be composed of 7 members. And that's it. There is no specification of who these members are to be. But from listening to Senator Brownback's statements about this, he envisions this as a blue ribbon panel, where the members would come from experts, basically, from retired performance folks, et cetera. So I like that. That's a way that the membership that we'd see is comparable to BRAC. The mission is very clear, and it has a very limited purpose, right? So it is to recommend the elimination or realignment of federal programs that are inefficient, duplicative, or wasteful. That's clear. It's not figure out the fiscal imbalance, figure out what to raise, what to cut, what to put where. It is find, what does he call it, inefficient, duplicative, or wasteful programs, and list those. That's a clear mission. What about criteria? Again, very clear criteria. CARFA sets out in detail what would qualify as a program that is inefficient, duplicative, or wasteful. Now, I'm not saying that I endorse the criteria that are in the bill of what would constitute as duplicative, wasteful, et cetera. I'm just saying they have criteria. This bill spells out what would be criteria that a panel could use to carry out their clear mission. So in that sense, it's a lot more like BRAC, although I think I'm going to find out it's not as clear-cut as that. So now, there's another thing, though, that I like about CARFA, and it's that in addition to making its assessments with these criteria, the Commission is mandated to consider the achievement of performance goals under the Government Performance and Results Act, GPRA. And GPRA is a law that's been around since 1993, which folks at Mercatus have been studying for a long time. Actually, we stopped recently. We used to do an annual report card of GPRA to see how agencies are complying with GPRA and what they're doing. And what GPRA basically does is it requires agencies to set out performance goals in terms of outcomes, not just outputs, at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year to see how they've done, whether they've met those goals, and to send a report, a performance report, to Congress. This was part of the Reinventing Government movement back in the 90s. And what we found, though, after 10 years of grading their performance reports is that we were grading them and we were seeing improvement in their performance reporting, but Congress was completely ignoring these performance reports. Agencies would duly send these to Congress, and Congress would just not look at them, at least not look at them as far as deciding which programs to fund, which programs to cut. Congress was not interested in looking at GPRA for funding. So I like that the CARFA requires this commission to take advantage of this huge body of data that's available on performance that has been generated by the agencies to make decisions, to serve as some guiding criteria for what is a useful or an outmoded program. So finally, on silent approval, it fails there. It has, basically the way CARFA would work, again, this panel would create a list of programs that should be eliminated, and that goes back to Congress. And at that point, that list is fast-tracked, so that it's fast-tracked out of committee, there can be no amendments, and there's an up or down vote on that list, but that is not the silent approval. Ultimately, a member has got to take a vote to cut program X or Y. So what are the secrets to success if you want to create a commission to tackle spending? You won't be surprised to hear the things I think are necessary. Membership, get the membership right, which means try to avoid putting folks on there who have political careers have elections in a few years, have a very clear mission that is not simply to be a mini Congress, but to do one thing, and give them clear criteria about how they should judge what should be cut. And finally, silent approval, which I think is really key, is really paramount. Now, that all said, there are some caveats about using a BRAC model. So the first thing is that after the first BRAC round, constituencies learned. They learned how to, and you can tell us about this, they really learned how to work around BRAC. The first time that the BRAC was presented, it was a unique process, and nobody had seen this thing before. But in the second, third, fourth BRAC round, the special interests were much more familiar with the system in these later rounds. In 2005 BRAC round, Texas Governor Rick Perry established something called a BRAC Response Strike Force, which was composed of state and local officials that were charged with lobbying the commission. And other states and localities have hired retired military officials and former BRAC members to lobby BRAC commissions. Another thing is that subsequent BRAC rounds after the first one took substantially longer than the first one, so it gave special interests time to organize. And additionally, I think this is very important. The first time the first round of BRAC cuts, you were looking at the low-hanging fruit. You were looking, after 10 years of not one major cut, right? And at the end of the Cold War, there were some pretty obvious targets. The further you get on after round, the targets get less obvious. So that's the first caveat. You have political learning after the first time you do it. The second thing is the scope of what can be tackled by a commission, right? So a military base tends to have a fence around it, right, which can serve as a very discrete, a base is a very discrete unit of analysis. And the contours of what constitutes a federal program is much more difficult to ascertain, right? So the current version of CARFA defines program as, quote, any activity or function of an agency. So, this encompasses the entire federal budget, right? Entitlements like Social Security and Medicare would be on there, entire bureaucracies, the whole Pentagon. So this is problematic, right? I think it's especially problematic for two reasons. First, while Congress may be willing to cede some authority to a commission in order, in exchange for political cover, that bargain probably would not extend to entitlements, right? For obvious reasons. They're popular with constituencies, and these constituencies are very well organized. And second, entitlement reform really is not amenable to sort of binary-like decision-making that you can do with a military base or just a smaller program, right? You simply can't close or realign Social Security, right? So fixing these entitlements will be a politically fraught matter where you're going to have to look at tweaking different factors, contributions, benefits, eligibility, age, et cetera, right? So to the extent that that a CARFA-like commission is given authority over the whole federal budget, including entitlements, it's going to start looking a lot more like a mini Congress. So the big caveat here is this probably won't work for entitlements. Entitlements are going to have to be done separately. This would work for discretionary spending, which gets you down to a much smaller part of the budget, but it's still a very important part of the budget that we oftentimes neglect because we're so worried about the entitlements, quite rightly. But here's a solution that could work for discretionary spending. So with that, thank you very much, and I will be happy to take questions.
Somebody doesn't like the menu when it comes out of BRAC, so they register a resolution or disapproval. And so on the last page, the Congress votes for this menu basis, or they vote against the menu?
They vote against.
They vote against it.
Yes. And so the idea is that when you are, when the BRAC Act first comes, you're voting to create a commission that would choose a list of bases and these bases will be closed if Congress takes no further action. So at that point, you're doing what the people want you to do. They want you to cut wasteful spending. And so you do that, and that's what happens. Then later, you're going to have somebody introduce a resolution of disapproval that says, you know, we're going to not do this. And at that point, if you vote for that, you're voting against cutting. You're voting to save a specific set of bases or programs. And that's very different than having to be on the record to vote for cutting a particular program or a particular base. Yes?
Dan Ells from the Congressional Research Service, and, oh, thank you. Okay. Dan Ells from the Congressional Research Service, and if I may, if you'll, with your permission, I would like to kind of expand a little bit and give you some more fine-grained description of how the BRAC process actually worked under the current statute. The current statute requires that there be a BRAC Commission that in fact does create a final list of recommended actions to the President, but it has significant executive branch and legislative branch input in this way. The process is set up such that the President appoints the members of the Commission, subject to Senate confirmation. But during that, Congress wrote into the law that the House and Senate leadership may advise the President of the 9 members of the Commission. They can advise the President on the appointment of 6 of those members. And it's based on seniority in various houses, et cetera. So Congress has a role in the appointment of the commissioners, but the President appoints them and the Senate confirms them. Then the next step in the process is that the agency, in this case the Department of Defense, which has in statute set out the criteria that it will use for selecting bases to be closed or realigned, the Department of Defense is required then to perform its analysis of individual bases before the Secretary of Defense creates and submits to the Commission his list of recommended base closure actions. So the DOD, in the past, let's take the 2005 BRAC round as an example. The 2005 BRAC round was authorized in late 2001, and they were to submit their recommendations to the Commission in May of 2005. So they had 4 years, essentially, to perform their analysis and create their list of recommendations, submit them to the Commission. And in doing that, they created a model for, valuing the various bases based on the statutory requirements that they do so. So they did that, and during the process, it was critical, I think, that the process was restricted to internal DOD information only. In other words, DOD went out, made up its list of what data would be required, and sent that out to the commands in the field to say, give us your input based, give us your metrics based on these criteria. We are calling data from you to be used in the analysis. And it could use only that data to perform its analysis and create its list of recommendations. It was closed off from the outside by statute. And in fact, everybody involved in it had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that they could not discuss the criteria with anybody outside of the BRAC process, outside of the DOD. All of this was being monitored and audited, by the way, throughout the entire process by the GAO. Congress said, we want auditors looking over your shoulder, and they will report to us on the validity of this process when we're done. Okay, fine. So DOD goes out, creates its list of recommended actions, and submits this now to the presidentially appointed and congressionally confirmed commission, which had its own staff to then perform its own analysis of the DOD recommendations. DOD had to turn over all of its analytical data, all of its internal communications, and the BRAC Commission was required then to visit the bases, to perform its own analysis, and it also was required to perform public hearings and accept now outside information. This is when you got the lobbying. But the Commission was given its list from DOD in May of 2005, and it had to have its list of recommendations to the President by September. So it had a very small window in which to perform its task, and therefore a very small window for it to be lobbied. And so by the required date, it submitted its list of recommendations, which was amended significantly from what DOD had recommended, to the President, and the President approved it. And from then on, it was on autopilot unless Congress passed a joint resolution of disapproval. And if you look at the congressional process for a joint resolution of disapproval, it is like a bill. It is introduced in one house, it must be passed by both houses, and then it must be signed by the President.
That's right.
So the President can exercise a veto over that joint resolution of disapproval.
Right.
So essentially, everybody's got a dog in the fight, but it's a very restricted process by which it can be influenced. And that's how in my opinion, that's how the BRAC Commission actually worked and got it through.
That's absolutely right. In what I've described here and in my study, I did not look at subsequent, I mean, I looked at them, but I kept to my study to the first BRAC, which is why I probably described it a little bit differently. What you described is a little bit more complicated because the process has
Well,
grown.
there are actually two different BRACs. The one that you described
Yeah.
from 1988
Yes,
was appointed by the Secretary of Defense.
that's right. Yep.
And then Congress sort of retroactively blessed the process.
Yes. And
And it was that commission that came up with the recommendations.
Mhm.
But everything since 1990.
That's right.
The current law, Defense-Based Closing and Realignment Act of 1990,
Yes.
as amended
Yes.
significantly, it created this separate process where the President
Yes.
appoints this commission. It is independent of the Secretary of Defense.
Yes.
And it works for the President, submits to the President, and then is on autopilot from there on.
That's right. And while I do think that obviously for something like a spending commission, you would want presidential appointment, Senate confirmation, I think that the model to look at is the first BRAC, especially because, like you say, it was created by the Secretary of Defense, and it worked sort of in open secret for a few months before Congress passed the BRAC Act, and then had a very short period of time. And special interested didn't know to go lobby it. But thank you for that. I mean,
Well,
yeah.
As I was listening to this, though,
Yes.
I think you hit on something very important. Oh, okay. I think you've hit on something very important. Whether and the difference between the first BRAC, I guess, and the subsequent BRACs is that if you take the second model, the current model of the BRAC Commission, then that puts the onus on the agencies, which has the manpower
yes.
to come up with an initial list of recommendations. Let's say, for example, taking programs, discretionary programs. I would suggest that letting the agencies, under a certain set of criteria, which have to be individual to the agencies, make their analysis and make the recommendations to the Commission. Then all the Commission has to do is essentially review that.
Mm-hmm.
And one significant thing about the BRAC Commission was, if the Commission wanted to change a Department of Defense recommendation, it had to cite which selection criteria set in statute
Mm-hmm.
the Secretary violated in making his recommendation, and then they could change it.
I think that's right, and I think this is where GIPRA could come in. You have these 10 years of GIPRA reports that are just sitting there, whereas this is the agency saying, this is what we're good at, this is what we're not so good at, this is the programs that are doing well, not doing well. I think that could really be useful in that sort of analysis. I think we have a question back there.
Yeah, can I ask a question? So under the 88 BRAC or the current or the most recent BRAC, if the president vetoes it, then would it require 2/3 to override the veto?
That's right. It's just like a bill.
So under that process, if you have 7 people who come to a determination, it would, and the president liked their determination, then
That would be
all it would take is 33%, 34% of one chamber
Mm-hmm.
to sustain the veto and let it through,
That's right.
which means that those appointments are very crucial.
Absolutely.
Right.
And this absolutely. And this is the point. The whole point of this is that it ties Congress's hands. Congress wants to cut spending in the abstract, but specifically about which program, this is where they have trouble. So what they're doing here is that they're tying their hands. They're voting to cut spending in the abstract and letting a blue ribbon panel choose which particular programs to cut. And then later, they always reserve to themselves the option, if the panel comes back and says, we're going to cut the entire Pentagon out, okay, they can undo that. There's always a way to undo that but it's very difficult. They've tied their hands to save the one little project that they like.
But as a follow-up to
Yes.
that, if you look at the legislative history for CARFA
Mhm.
and BRAC, going back to what Mr. Army said, one of the biggest concerns they had was potential for politicization of the process.
That's right.
And the way you put it was, you know, people being concerned about political careers and
Mhm.
stuff like that. Actually, I think the concern at the time was less about political careers in some ways than it was bringing political bias to the criteria for what goes on the cut list.
I mean, I'll tell you what the real political concern was. They were concerned, I mean, and we've seen this, I'd have to go back and look at the figures, but you know, there's examples of President Johnson, President Nixon cutting bases in the districts of members who voted against them or didn't like them. So there's even some question of whether Reagan threatened to do some of that.
Well, and an implication then
Yes.
is that the appointment structure for
yes.
this is pretty crucial. And one thing that you didn't really address in the presentation was that in some of the proposals that have been put forth, you know, majority of the members of this commission would be appointed in a way that would, you know, where the partisan balance of the commission might be lopsided.
Sure.
And there's not really a lot of assurance from Congress's perspective that it would not be politicized. And as a consequence, if the constellation of stars were aligned such that, you know, the president could ram something through with the assurance that a veto couldn't be overcome with 33, you know, percent plus one, then it gives tremendous power to the president potentially.
I think that's right, and that's a very real concern. I think that defining the mission and the criteria helps get to limit that power. But you're absolutely right. Choosing the members of this commission is paramount. My ideal pie in the sky commission would be Justice O'Connor and Justice Souter heading up, right? Wouldn't that be terrific? I mean, you can get better than that. And you can get more serious, more, you know, not politically, no political careers there. That would be great. So just plant a seed in your heads.
I guess I have a few, there were a few things that occurred to me in listening to I understand with BRAC, those bases aren't authorized in statute, and they aren't established in statute. So I'm kind of curious how is it constitutional for a commission outside Congress to undo authorized programs or even agencies? And I guess the next thing would be like a lot of that GEPRA data is really bad.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of the outcomes are terrible.
Yep.
Just from the agencies that I work with. So I'm kind of curious how that, and then it seems like, you know, discretionary non-defense spending is like a quarter
I didn't
of
say
our budget.
I didn't say non-defense. I said discretionary.
So it seems
Okay.
like it would mostly be defense because, I mean, it seems like that's where there would be the most flexibility for cuts. And I guess it seems like tax increases would have to enter into there, and you can't, you know, to get to undo the, you know, and it seems hard to imagine a commission. I don't know how you could write a law that would give a commission authority to actually do anything substantive on taxes.
Right. I'm using this as a model. I don't have all the answers. I think this would definitely be challenged constitutionally, no matter how you write it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want to weasel out of it, but I don't have an answer for those concerns. As far as GIPRA and the bad data, you're right, but this is holding the agencies accountable for what they've produced. And so, you know, this sort of bad data that they've produced for these many years is going to have to serve as a starting point for looking at what they're doing. Yes. There is one which is a very good example of political cover, which is Senator Specter. He voted for BRAC because, like all other right-thinking members. He was against military waste. He was for cutting bases, and he was very vocal about supporting the BRAC Act and voted for it. Then the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was on the list. And at that point, this was the worst. And he actually argued the case before the Supreme Court himself personally. And he received a lot of plaudits back home for that. But the Supreme Court ultimately held that this was constitutional.
One other question. You talked about criteria and the need for them to be objective. I think one of the lessons out there when it comes to assessments of government performance is that people have different definitions of success sometimes for the same program, and which kind of undermines arguably the contention that in some ways it is all that objective. A part program, a program that was parted, for example, you had very diverse views on that. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by objectivity?
Just to clarify, I never said objective criteria. I said clear criteria.
Well, it says here
On
objective criteria.
Where did I say that? Okay, well then I meant clear criteria. I guess what I want to convey to you is that Congress needs to be very clear about the choices that are available to the Commission. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, this might be, I don't mean objective because you're not going to get that, All right.
Well,
Thank
if
you
there
very
are no
much.
more questions, thank you very much. That was a great question and answer session. We will have this video posted up on our website, mercatus.org, either later this afternoon or tomorrow, probably. If you could drop off those survey forms for us or fax them back to us, we would really appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. We'll be here next month with another course, so you can look forward to that. Thank you, everybody. Oh, and if anybody would like a longer copy of the working paper, I have several in the back that I can